Good afternoon. Hello. I'm Kate Bartholomew, Chair of the Atlantic Chapter of the Sierra Club. Welcome to this very important discussion of a serious problem hiding in plain sight: the spreading of toxic sewage sludge on farms, gardens, and golf courses, and the inaction of the state in preventing it. Our new report, issued today, used the Freedom of Information law to track what turned out to be the state's inaction despite finding toxic PFAS at 8 sewage treatment plants. Sewage sludge is frequently spread on land as a disposal method, with claims that it is a safe fertilizer or soil amendment. The state is currently circulating 2 proposed policies that would increase land spreading as a way to get rid of sewage sludge, as a beneficial use, actually. We are calling for a ban on the land application of sewage sludge in New York State to protect our farms, our health, our waters, and our planet. I am joined as moderator today by Caitlin Ferrante, the Conservation Program Manager of our chapter. Caitlin?
Thank you, Kate. All right. So I am, like Kate said, my name is Caitlin Ferrante. I am with the Sierra Club Atlantic chapter. And as we get started in our presentation, I wanted to state, we'll ask reporters to put any questions that they may have in the chat. Those questions will come through to us as co-hosts. So identify your name and your news outlet, and that will put you in a stack in terms of allowing reporters to ask questions at the end. So if there are any additional attendees who have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat as well, and we will open for questions at the end if time is permitting. The meeting will also be recorded and circulated later today along with the full report. I'll make sure that everyone has a copy of that, anyone who has attended. So we will be hearing from a vast coalition of decision makers, advocates, and community impacted individuals. And I believe, I just want to make sure that we have some, I believe Assembly Member Anna Kellis is with us. So I am going to turn it over to her first, who has been a champion on so many toxics issues. So I am going to turn over to Assembly Member Anna Kellis. Thank you so much for joining us, Assembly Member.
Absolutely wonderful to be here. This is such a hugely important topic. So, so absolutely happy to be here. I know you'll get a lot of coverage of why this is so important, but I did just want to reiterate, we are talking about chemicals. There's a reason that they're called forever chemicals, PFAS chemicals, because they do not degrade. They also build up in organic tissue. So, you know, if you are eating fish consistently, for example, that have high levels of PFAS, that will build up in your own body. Other things are that it can pass through breast milk. It can pass through a umbilical cord. So for women who are pregnant, particularly dangerous. They do build up in the body. They are associated with cancer and other related illnesses. Very dangerous. And we know that almost all humans in the United States have, anyone who's been tested for PFAS have found PFAS levels in human body tissue. So this is a really serious issue. We should not be taking it lightly. The fact that it is everywhere and the fact that we are not aware of it is unacceptable. What we are talking about here is the active permitting, allowing, and even fostering of PFAS contaminated sewer sludge from being spread over farmland to create food that we then consume. So it's literally creating a mechanism to get PFAS to bioaccumulate in human tissue. I can't even think of a mechanism that would do that more effectively than this. And the fact that we as a state are talking about actually creating a mechanism to increase the amount of sewage sludge or biosolids that are allowed to be spread on farmland blows my mind. So, you know, the first is that we need to stop spreading the PFAS materials like biosolids that we already are aware of. But the thing that I wanted to bring to the table is the acknowledgement that we aren't even tracking what is distributing or creating the PFAS and releasing it into water or transferring it to municipal waste treatment facilities that are the origins of PFAS in the first place. So I am carrying a bill with Senator May, and it is a PFAS disclosure bill. And what it would require is that any entity that has an individual species permit would be required to monitor for a year quarterly their effluent directly discharging into surface water and groundwater, and to report any PFAS levels that are found. It would also require that anyone getting a new species permit, individual species permit, would also have to do this initial year analysis. And if it is found that they have PFAS, then they have to continue to do that analysis and disclose that information. We need to start gathering information about where the PFAS is coming from in the first place. Also in this bill would require that industrial companies like, for example, landfills, this is just one example, they transfer their waste leachate to public municipal treatment facilities. It would require that they test and disclose in a similar mechanism before it is transferred to the wastewater treatment facilities. Why is that important? Because wastewater treatment facilities in New York do not have the technology to remove PFAS from the material that they are processing, and therefore the PFAS is then going directly back into the effluent and into water. So it's important that we both know where it's coming from, we monitor and track it, and then for the materials where we already know they're contaminated with PFAS, we don't promote the spread of them through the state, and certainly not to grow our food. So I am so thankful that you are all here. This is a phenomenally important issue. We have seen severe issues with livestock that have been contaminated with PFAS, or drinking water that's contaminated. We have seen issues with, obviously with humans, and it is human created. This is a problem that we ourselves have created, and therefore it's a problem that we ourselves need to fix. So thank you everyone for being here. So happy to be with you, and I look forward to hearing from everyone else.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Assembly Member. Truly, like I said before, has been an advocate on these issues, and I just am very grateful to have your continued support on this issue.
Absolutely.
So next we will be hearing from Tracy Frisch, Chair of the Clean Air Action Network of Glens Falls and report co-author. We'll also be hearing from 3 other New Yorkers who are challenging PFAS-ridden sewage sludge in their localities, and other advocates at the end. But first, I wanted to hand it off to Tracy. Tracy, thank you so much for speaking today.
Thank you. I'm going to be sharing some slides, so I'll get started with that as soon as I can figure it out. Okay. And I want to say also that I'm delighted to be here. I joined the Sierra Club because I was really concerned about PFAS in sewage sludge. And so it's like a dream that this is actually coming to fruition with such a great team and of concerned individuals. And thank you, Assembly Member Kellis, for your work. So I'm going to try to move through this quickly. Whoops, if I can figure, okay. So PFAS are considered emerging contaminants, even though they've been used extensively in consumer products since the 1940s. There are 15,000 different PFAS compounds, according to the most recent EPA estimate. But the typical lab test can only detect 30 compounds. And so,
sorry, Tracy, the screen that we're seeing just says loading.
Oh no. Okay.
Is it your Google? Is it the slides?
Well, they're loaded here.
Let me see, can
And I
you?
have-
Go
yeah,
ahead.
thank you for letting me know. I mean, I could just talk and move the slides along, and but I have high-speed internet. I have
It might be
wondering,
just that you're sharing this one screen and it popped up on a new screen, Tracy. So if
yeah.
you stop the presentation, we might be able to see the slides even if they're smaller.
Okay, is that better? Can you
Yes,
see
yep.
that? Okay, okay, well, who knows? Okay, so
Sorry to interrupt.
yeah, so the best way to find out how much PFAS is in a material is actually to test for the total organic fluorine content. Because organic fluorine is anything with a carbon fluorine bond, and that is pretty much not found in nature. It would be PFAS. So these are PFAS consists of a carbon backbone with 2 fluorine atoms bonded to each carbon. That is the typical PFAS. And the bond is so strong that it requires a tremendous amount of energy to break. Even incinerators do not operate at temperatures high enough to destroy PFAS. So they're extremely persistent. And the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants has determined that PFAS fit that classification, along with things like PCBs and DDT. In fact, PFAS are more persistent than PCBs and DDT. So it's important to kind of understand why PFAS are so widely used in industry, in commerce, and consumer applications. They have these properties: fire and heat resistant and no stick. Think Teflon, stain resistant, water repellent, and oil and grease resistant. But they also have these other fun characteristics that are harming our health and environment: their persistence, toxicity, the fact that plants take them up, they bioaccumulate up the food chain, they tend to leach through the soil, mobile in the environment, and they dissolve in water. Unlike PCBs and DDT, they're very water soluble typically. Oops, I'm sorry. A physician will be talking about human health effects, but I just want to say there have been large human epidemiological studies, as well as lab animal studies, as well as studies with cells. And I'm just going to mention one because it shocked me. I was at a webinar in the last 6 months, led by a physician scientist who was studying the link which they found between fatty liver disease in children and high levels of PFAS in children's blood. And they documented that in multiple ways, that link was real, including elevated liver enzymes in a lab when PFAS was introduced to those cells. So this is the most important slide. Assembly Member Kellis mentioned one of the reasons that we have PFAS in sewage sludge, and that's that large volumes of untreated landfill leachate, which always has high concentration of PFAS, are accepted by some wastewater treatment plants. But there's thousands of consumer and commercial products that contain PFAS, ranging from cosmetics and body care products to floor wax, cleaning supplies, adhesives, paints, caulk, some clothing, and stain resistant products. And but the most alarming source of PFAS has just been, I would say, has just been documented by a study of toilet paper. And I'll get to that in a moment. But the PFAS gets in toilet paper from the pulping process in paper mills, which suggests that PFAS is going to be present at incidental levels, not intentionally added, in all paper. And that is really disturbing to me. Time magazine had a major article about this in March, right after the study was, this peer-reviewed study was published. And there's one take home from this study. The most prevalent type of PFAS that was found in the toilet paper samples from 4 continents, as well as in 8 wastewater treatment plants, for which they tested the sewage sludge, was a precursor called 6,2-dipap. This is a PFAS type chemical which would not be detected in the standard tests, and it isn't one of the most notorious PFAS, PFOA or PFOS. And you'll see why I mention this later. A great study done a couple of years ago by our friends at the Michigan Sierra Club and Ann Arbor Ecology Center called Sludge in the Garden. It's easy to find this study online. They tested bagged compost made from sewage sludge. It's labeled as derived from biosolids on the bag. And they tested for 33 PFAS compounds, and they found 24 of them, at least in the parts per billion in one or more samples. And so the levels ranged from about 40 parts per billion and over 200 parts per billion. The drinking water standard in New York is 10 parts per trillion, so more than 1,000 times lower. And these compounds readily leach into groundwater. So here is the study presented in a different way, but the sample second to the right comes from my county, Washington County, from the sewer district, where they compost the sewage sludge, and they distribute it to any farmers, landscapers, gardeners, or school systems that might want it to put on their lawns or playing fields or on their farms and gardens. And that one had, it looks like close to 150 parts per billion of different PFAS compounds. Now, in New York, through a Freedom of Information law request, we obtained data from the New York State DEC's testing of sewage sludge. They only tested 8 wastewater treatment plants as of about a year ago. And these samples the sampling was done in 2017. They found levels that are in the range of the bagged compost. You can see around 40 up to, I can't tell what that is. It looks like it's over 200. And I will just refer you to the bottom of this slide. The state of Maine established screening levels for 2 PFAS compounds, those notorious ones, PFOA and PFOS. 2.5 and a little over 5 parts per billion. Every sample tested by the state exceeded those levels for those compounds, and we have the data, not just the bar graph, and it's in the appendix of the report, and as did all the samples tested in Maine. So in May, DEC issued a proposed PFAS standard for biosolids, and it was 20 parts per billion. So between 10 and, well, a number of times higher than the Maine standard, screening standard, which has been superseded by an all-out ban on the use of sewage sludge as a soil amendment or fertilizer. The standard that DEC is proposing is very high. I like to compare it to setting a speed limit of 300 miles per hour. It will not protect public health or the environment. And it also errs in failing to consider those other PFAS chemicals, such as the one that's most prevalent in sewage sludge and toilet paper. This I won't go into, but there's a vicious cycle of contamination from wastewater treatment plants, landfills, and our farms and gardens, and our fish and waterways. I mentioned that Maine has banned the land application a little over a year ago. The two biggest newspapers in Maine put printed editorials calling for this ban in February of 2022. And Maine has taken a very proactive stand, including establishing a $60 million farmer compensation fund and testing very widely for PFAS contamination anywhere that biosolids have been spread in the past. And I just want to end by saying the EPA Inspector General put out a report a little less than 5 years ago, stating that EPA cannot assess the impact of the hundreds of unregulated pollutants in land-applied biosolids on human health and the environment. Even if there was no PFAS in sewage sludge, which is something we should work towards, there are so many other unregulated chemicals that would be poisoning the land and our food and our health. So with that, I'd like to end and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tracy. Just a reminder too that the biosolids is another name for sewage sludge. So when we go back and forth between those, that's they're the same thing. So I'm going to hand off to Wayne Miller next, who's a farmer in Franklin County. He's an activist and also a report co-author as well. So I'm gonna turn it over to Wayne.
Well, good afternoon, and please forgive any background noise, any squawking. There are a pair of robins who have a nest nearby who think I'm a danger. I know how they feel when I consider the issue of sludge spreading. My name is Wayne Miller. Our fields behind me are certified organic. Our woods that border the fields are habitat for all sorts of wildlife. Just over my right shoulder is a well that is our drinking water supply. And on my left are my organic gardens, and off in the distance, I'm looking at the St. Lawrence Valley and the Ontario-Quebec border. In 2018, DEC reported that biosolids are being spread in a majority of New York's counties. I live in Franklin County. DEC's data shows that more sludge is brought to my county than combined total of the rest of the state. More than 500,000 tons brought here in the last decade. Why does this alarm me? Perfluoroalkaloid substances sounds poetic and it sounds like gibberish, so I prefer to use PFAS, standing for poisoning food and animals, is short-sighted. PFAS are so toxic that the EPA says there is no safe level. They only set levels down to that which they can test for. Others will explain and have explained some of the health benefits. I'll focus on PFAS in food. The food we eat, along with cosmetics, laundry residue, and much more, becomes sewage. Biosolids concentrate the PFAS in sewage. If you live in Saratoga County or Long Island, Burlington, Vermont, or even Ottawa or Toronto, your sewer waste is brought to my county. Then it's minimally processed to kill pathogens, but nothing is done to remove the heavy metals or PFAS, forever chemicals. This biosolid product is then proclaimed fertilizer and spread on farm fields. Plants grown on those lands take up the PFAS along with the beneficial nutrients that DEC uses to justify this practice. And now DEC wants to radically expand sludge spreading. Crops raised or animals fed those crops then become a part of a tainted food chain. Human consumption of such foods completes the circle and further embeds the contamination. Rinse and repeat. And we have a downward spiral where we are the recipients of ever increasing amounts of PFAS. The good news is that we don't have to spread contaminated sludge where our food is grown. We have to play the long game here and stop spreading forever chemicals. Remember, poisoning food and animals is short-sighted. It's all about the PFAS. And thank you. I'll turn it back over to Caitlin.
Thank you so much, Wayne. I am going to turn it over. We have a special guest from Maine, Adam Nordell, who's an organic farmer in Maine who discovered dangerous PFAS chemicals on his songbird farm. He's now the staff of Defend Our Health, who took a leadership role on the issue in Maine. And I'm going to share a link for him in the chat as well, but I want to turn it over to Adam. Thank you so much for being here today.
Well, thank you for having me, Caitlin, and thank you to Sierra Club New York for hosting this. And I guess if I could, I'm going to start with a quick quote from Dr. Donald Lisk, who was interviewed by the New York Times in 1981, 2 years before I was born, for an article in which he advocates that the state of New York extend a moratorium on sludge spreading in your state. Donald Lisk said, he told the New York Times, "We found that there's practically no such thing as clean sludge. Sludge is the product of practically everything in our society and may contain virtually any element and a galaxy of dangerous chemicals depending on the spectrum of industries in the area. It's just too poisonous and unpredictable to use on land. Using sludge on land may be hazardous to future generations too. Once these chemicals are in the soil," Dr. Lisk said, "they do not go away. Some travel up into plants while others leach down and could contaminate the groundwater." So Dr. Donald Lisk, who was the head of the toxic chemicals laboratory at Cornell, correctly anticipated everything, all of the concerns that Wayne just raised about the risks of sludge spreading. And unfortunately, 30 some years after that article was published, 40 some years after that article was published, my wife and I found point proof of those concerns. Our farm had been managed organically for 7 years under our management, and been managed previously under organic practices for the previous 25 years. But a prior generation in the early 1990s spread the land with sludge from 2 wastewater treatment districts for a total of 4 years. And winter before last winter of 2021-2022, my wife and I discovered that our well was contaminated more than 400 times Maine's interim drinking water standard for PFAS, which our standard is 20 parts per trillion for a sum of 6 regulated chemicals. Our well tested about 8,000 parts per trillion. Most of that was PFOA and PFOS, which are the 2 chemicals that we know we should be concerned about to the greatest extent. We should be concerned about all PFAS, but those ones have been studied and the health impacts have been well documented. The National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine recently released a sprawling report where they summarized all of the available medical literature on the clinical implications of PFAS exposure. And they highlighted elevated risk for a number of cancers, including kidney cancer, testicular cancer, breast cancer, a gastrointestinal autoimmune disorder, impacts to the thyroid, and more, a bunch of terrible illnesses. Those impacts start at a blood serum level of 20 parts per billion for the combined sum of 7 different PFAS chemicals. My blood serum tested about 3,500 parts per billion last spring after I discovered the contamination. We're taking an enormous risk when we spread sludge on farmland. Now we have the tools to look, as Tracy said, for a small number of PFAS chemicals and make management decisions based on the presence or absence of those specific chemicals. But 40 years ago, when Donald Lisk raised these concerns, we weren't talking about PFAS, but many people knew the contents of sludge were unquantifiable. Sludge was unquantifiably toxic. And we know today that regardless of the PFOA and PFOS levels, there are going to be other concerns, other toxic chemicals that we'll be talking about in 10 years or in 20 years. we need to move away from this practice. This is not a sustainable way to manage our farmland. This is not a sustainable way to protect our rural communities, and certainly not a way to be treating our farm system, since we all eat food that comes from farms. Well, thank you all for being here, and thank you again to Sierra Club New York for hosting this.
Thank you so much, Adam. I think it's just really important to reiterate that it's just that point that it's too poisonous and unpredictable. It's really resonates. I'm going to turn it over next to Michael Bolino, who is the New York town supervisor in the town of Thurston. Michael, I'm glad you could join us today.
Thank you. I appreciate it. So I'd like to just give a little background of our issue in Thurston. We're dealing with a decades-old land spreading operation that dates back to the late 70s into the 80s. There's the farm that has undertaken this land spreading, they currently are permitted through DEC to take in sewer sludge from 28 wastewater treatment facilities throughout the southern tier as well as northern tier. In July of last year, Casella Organics from Maine purchased part of this operation. This operation spans 2,800 acres that covers Thurston primarily, but also covers the neighboring town of Cameron, as well as Bath, the county seat of Steuben County. Casella Organics purchased and then leased the rest of this land, and their intent is to the CAFOs originally, the CAFOs, those have been removed. The food waste has been removed from the permit, and they intend to add the Bay Park wastewater treatment facility in Nassau County, which Nassau County, the water there is heavily contaminated with PFAS. It seemed, there's no way to filter this out of the sewer sludge. So all of this PFAS contaminated sewer sludge is destined for Thurston. And, this treatment facility has the output of the 28 other currently permitted wastewater treatment facilities. So they could possibly double the operation in Thurston. So we, we as a town, we passed a moratorium on any new expansions or any new permits in February of this year. And we have certainly, as you would expect, we've received a lot of pushback from Casella. Even just yesterday, they sent a mailing out to area residents this past week, and their big claim is that it's organic. This is organic material, so this misinformation. I'm glad that the Assemblywoman Anna Kellis is on the call today, because I'm really I'm pleading with state officials to do something to ban this practice at the state level. It's such as Maine has done. I brought this up, Casella officials did a presentation to the Thurston Town Board in February, and I brought up the fact that I asked them, could you do what you would like to do here in Thurston in the state of Maine? And they said, no, we cannot. So here we have a Maine-based company coming to New York to contaminate more our farmland. And thanks to the Sierra Club, thanks to Bill Mattingly for organizing water testing in the Bonnie Hill region. It's a hamlet of Thurston with property. They tested 35 water sources, groundwater, home water wells earlier this year in March and April, and they found these were not certified tests, but they found contamination, PFAS contamination in these water wells. above the current EPA and DEC standards. I've reached out to Kim Merchant as well as Timothy Walsh, asking for a meeting in Thurston, prior to issuing their final ruling here on adding Bay Park. They haven't done it yet, but it seems that they are in the process of doing this despite, numerous concerns from area residents. So that's, just a few of my, and that's just a minor, small update on what we're dealing with here in Thurston. So I appreciate it. I appreciate you giving me the chance to speak today.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
We are going to turn it over to Larissa Driska, Concerned Health Professionals of New York. Larissa, we look forward to hearing your presentation today.
Thank you. I'm a board certified pediatrician and also a co-founder of Concerned Health Professionals of New York. And a number of you may be familiar with our work, the compendium that documents the harms and risks of fracking and its associated infrastructure. And you'll be interested to know that among the chemicals generated during fracking, PFAS are included. That chemical compound, perfluorooctanoic acid, or PFOA, is just one of an estimated, Tracy mentioned 15,000 perfluoroalkyl substances. That's that class of synthetic chemical compounds that we know as PFAS, that were and have remained largely unregulated, and therefore the public is not protected. Some people call it C8 because there are 8 carbons that form the backbone of this, and to that are attached the fluorides. And so what's happened is decades of widespread use have left these forever chemicals, and various people have mentioned why they're forever chemicals. They're ubiquitous in our environment and in human bodies. So while we have some research, there are many unknowns, and there are thousands of PFAS with unique properties, and they have potentially different toxicity levels and therefore different health effects. But what we do know is that it's cumulative and that it takes a minuscule amount to cause damage. And since the science was unclear or perhaps suppressed, as it was with cigarettes and fracking chemicals, there were and are inadequate regulations. Last year, there was hope that some regulations could be making a change. The EPA proposed strategies to remediate, restrict, and also to research those substances. But, and among those actions were drinking water regulations. The EPA recently reassessed what constitutes health protective levels of PFOA and PFOS in drinking water. Some years ago, in 2016, that threshold was 70 parts per trillion, and now it's changed to 0.004 parts per trillion for PFOA and 0.02 for PFOS. And that indicates to us that there are no safe levels. It means you shouldn't have any of this chemical in your water. Like the EPA has done, the New York State Department of Health should strengthen its drinking water standards for the PFAS to conform at least with EPA's proposed federal maximum contaminant levels, which they issued just this year. These advisory levels are based on new science and consider lifetime exposure. And the data indicate that some negative health effects can occur with concentrations of PFOA and PFOS in water that have near zero amounts. And And the EPA lists several health concerns. If you want to put up the slide, that includes breast cancer, kidney cancer, high cholesterol, thyroid disease, low birth weight, pregnancy complications, and issues related to the cardiovascular and immune systems. For me, as a pediatrician, suppression of vaccine response, which is decreased serum antibody concentrations after you get a vaccine in children, is an important one, especially in view of COVID and vaccinations for that. In addition, PFAS pass through the umbilical cord to the fetus and through breast milk in the nursing baby. So it seems that wherever there are organs that concentrate or excrete, that accumulate and then excrete these chemicals, that's where they seem to be causing the most harm. Kidney, breast, testicles. Unfortunately, Abby, it doesn't look like the slide is coming on, but that's okay. You've seen it previously in Tracy's presentation, and it's also in the executive summary that Sierra Club has prepared. Exposure to PFAS is pervasive. And researchers for the CDC and have detected PFAS in serum samples in almost everyone tested since 1999, and they consider these substances a public health concern. And recall, as many people have now said, there is no safe level. Dealing with the related health effects isn't the only challenge, because these forever chemicals are permanent in the environment. As of now, there's no safe or a really effective way to dispose of them. They're found, PFAS is found in air, soil, fish, the animals you hunt, the animals that you raise, and water sources, including rainwater around the globe. It's used, and its use as a sludge fertilizer on agricultural lands is a terrible idea from the health perspective, because it will endanger farm workers, their families, neighbors, consumers, all of the people who work with the gardeners, the landscapers, as well as the environment. No amount of PFAS is safe. PFAS don't degrade. They're found in all recently tested wastewater treatment plant, biosolid and effluent. So I would suggest that we follow the recommendations of at least of EPA and these updated recommendations coming from the Sierra Club. No amount of PFAS is safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Larsa. As you said, no amount of PFAS is safe. I'm going to turn it over to Bobby Wilding, Executive Director of Clean and Healthy New York. Thank you so much for being here, Bobby. You have such great knowledge on, on this issue, so I'm looking forward to your presentation today.
Thanks so much, Caitlin, and thanks to everybody who's here today. And thank you, Sierra Club, for putting together this really important report. Other speakers have already highlighted the way in which biosolids and spreading of sewage sludge sounds like a great idea because of the nutrients, but PFAS is just one example of the toxic chemicals that are present in it. When we look at toxic chemicals and why they end up in places like our sewage sludge, it's always you have to trace it back up to the tap. So why are we using all of these toxic chemicals? We have significant failures in the way our chemical regulatory system works in the United States. And together with Sierra Club and many other organizations who are part of the Just Green Partnership, I'm really proud of the work that we've been doing at the state level to ban PFAS and other toxics in products and to drive those toxic chemicals out of our economy, out of our materials entirely. on top of a bill that just passed the New York State Senate today is a bill that bans PFAS and other toxic chemicals in menstrual products. Last year, New York banned PFAS in apparel. And in the past, we've banned PFAS in firefighting foam, which is a significant direct vector to drinking water, and in food packaging, which exposes us both directly and indirectly. We need action to turn off the tap. That's really the only way we're going to stop having PFAS and stop having this problem from making it any worse. Obviously, we're left with the legacy of PFAS that have already been released into our environment and that we've built up in our bodies. So this year, our coalition has been highlighting a bill that would ban PFAS in many different product sectors, including paints, other textiles, cleaning products, ski wax. And New York will not be alone when it passes this legislation. The state of Maine has already put in place broad restrictions on PFAS with the goal of eliminating unavoidable uses by 2030. The state of Minnesota just this year, just very, very recently, included a plan to both set out a long-term goal for that, but also some very specific restrictions that include many of the things that New York has been either won or is fighting to win in specific with shorter timelines. States make a huge difference in this. We know that when we pass laws here in New York that restrict toxic chemicals in products, that there's a profound ripple effect that can be felt around the globe. We know that manufacturers are not just making products for New York, and New York is a major market. So when we make a change here, we can impact decisions for this country and really change the way that people are doing calculations for what kind of materials they're going to produce or chemicals are going to manufacture globally. That is why I'm really excited about the work that we're doing. I'm really hopeful that we have a safe personal care and cosmetics bill that includes a full ban on PFAS, including in byproducts and contaminants, that is moving. It's on the floor of the state Senate and in the Ways and Means Committee in the Assembly. We make a difference when we take this action, and it has the cascading effect of removing these toxic chemicals from things like our sewage sludge. We know that we're flushing our cosmetics down the drain. We know that when we rinse our paintbrushes, that paint's going down the drain. We know that all of the things we ingest pass through us and head down into sewage sludge. And it's time to turn off the tap. And really, it's essential to take all of the steps all along the supply chain. But the sewage sludge being toxic is really just the alarm bell that we have problems much further up the supply chain and that action is needed. So I'm really so happy to have partnered with Sierra Club from many of the chapters across the state to work on this issue, and look forward to doing more in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bobby. We were supposed to have someone join us from New York City Solid Waste Advisory Board. I think they might have not been able to join us today. So I'm just going to turn it over to Tracy Frisch again real quickly, just to say a few words about this issue and how the New York City Department of Sanitation is trying to figure this out as well.
So we were going to hear from Matt Savello, who is the chair of the Manhattan Solid Waste Advisory Board. The solid waste advisory boards, for which there are 4, every borough except for Staten Island, have been extremely concerned about a plan to co-digest food waste with sewage sludge, thus making the food waste into toxic waste. And so I believe that is what Matt was going to address us today about, and that struggle is that debate is ongoing. I will just add that the New York State Climate Scoping Plan recommended that really toxic practice. And so it is up to us to push back on that as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. And yes, so I think she had mentioned this in the chat before that the solid waste management plan is taking comments through June 14th. So if folks do have things that they would like to comment in terms of that, I can make sure in the follow-up email that includes information on how you can make comments on that solid waste management plan as well. So as we wrap up, I'm going to just turn it over to my colleague, Roger Downs, the Conservation Director for the Sierra Club Atlantic chapter, and just highlight a few of what the takeaways and the asks are within the report. So Roger, you're up.
Thanks, Caitlin. And, I think it admittedly releasing a report with recommended policy changes on the last few days of the legislative session may not reflect the best timing. But I think we know crisis seldom comes with convenience. We're hoping that lawmakers will take back to their districts this information, pass the current slate of PFAS bills before the legislature, and engage in an open public comment period for New York State's draft solid waste management plan, which concludes June 14th, but we're hoping that it will be extended to maximize public comment. Of the dozen or so recommendations within the report, and I urge everyone to read it, we thought it would be good to conclude by highlighting a few, and these are recommendations you've heard throughout this presentation. And for one, and very loudly, through legislation, executive order, or emergency agency action, New York State should stop the spreading of sewage sludge on fields and farms and end the production, sale, and distribution of soil amendment products, including bagged compost, from sewage sludge due to the strong evidence of their widespread contamination with PFAS. The New York State legislature should pass the PFAS Surface Water Discharge Disclosure Act, which requires testing of wastewater treatment plant effluent for PFAS contamination. I am so grateful to Assemblymember Anna Kellis for talking to us about it and being a champion here. I think you can find the number in the chat, but I think we anticipate many precautionary policies will flow from the data collected as a result of that legislation. And the New York State legislature in these final days should continue to eliminate upstream products and materials containing PFAS from the waste stream as much as possible, starting with an across-the-board ban on the intentional addition of all PFAS compounds in consumer and commercial products. And Bobby Wilding did a wonderful job in describing all the bills. And I think this year we're opposed to get a ban on PFAS and anti-fogging spray wipes. As a result of the pandemic, everyone was spraying their glasses with these anti-fogging agents. Little did we all know that they're laden with PFAS, and banning PFAS from menstrual products. But as Bobby noted, there is a long list of other products we need to tackle. New York State has made great strides in diverting organics and food waste from our landfills to reduce greenhouse gases and create valuable soil building compost. But as Tracy said just moments ago, the climate scoping plan and other state policies still encourage the mixing of food waste with sewage sludge and wastewater biosolids in anaerobic digesters and other composting mechanisms. And mixing food waste, which is a relatively clean organic feedstock, with sewage sludge that is highly contaminated with PFAS, it is an incredible waste of an amazing resource, and it becomes this horrible vector of cancer-causing PFAS. And lastly, we believe that New York State should establish a compensation fund paid for by companies responsible for creating PFAS chemicals to support farmers who may lose their livelihood and their ability to farm their agricultural lands when PFAS contamination is found. Again, I encourage folks to read the full report for more information and ideas for action. Thank you, and I hope we have time for questions.
Thank you, Roger. So I have been getting a few questions in the chat. I'm going to open up or unmute. Peter Mantius had a question for Assemblymember Kellis regarding her bill. So I will turn it over to Peter.
Yeah, hi, Anna. I just wanted to get an update on the status of your bill and what are the prospects of the bill.
Thank you. So right now, we just updated it again yesterday. with some final amendments. It is moving in the Senate. I am trying to get it moving in the Assembly. Of course, if it moves in one house, it really helps move things in the other house. So we expect it may get through one this session, and I feel pretty confident that if not this session, then it will pass the other house next session.
Thank you, Assembly
thanks.
Member. Oops, sorry, Peter. I don't see any other reporter questions as of right now. If reporters do have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. But there were a few other questions. One of the questions was, what is the state of monitoring of sewage sludge for PFAS and other toxic chemicals in New York? And what is the state of technology to prevent and remove these chemicals from sewage sludge? You know, that was at the very beginning of the report or of the presentation, if others wanted to chime in.
I can take that if no one else
Yes,
wants.
go ahead, Tracy. Yep.
Okay. DEC was had written a contract with SUNY ESF in Syracuse to do some testing. They have the testing capacity. I am not, last we checked, that contract had not been executed. It may have been executed by now. The plan was to test for 100, to test sewage sludge at 100 wastewater treatment plants. However, there are more than 600 in New York. There was no plan to test soil or water that might have been contaminated by land application of this toxic material. As far as removing PFAS, there is no, I'm trying to keep up with destruction technologies for PFAS. There are some methods that are still kind of in the process of being, you know, researched, and some are, you know, beginning to be commercialized for destroying PFAS in water. But sewage sludge is a much more complex material, and these kinds of technologies, A, they're costly, and B, they would probably destroy anything else in sewage sludge, so it would no longer be useful as a fertilizer. I mean, it isn't useful now, but it would no longer have those nutrients in, you know. So I will just say that there is, I do not believe that there's going to be any technology for removing PFAS from sewage sludge in the near future. And I will just mention how PCB contaminated soil. I live about 12 miles from Fort Edward, which was highly contaminated by GE. And the way they're doing it is there's a company that has a burner. People call it the dirt burner, and they're heating up PCB contaminated soil. And I would imagine there's toxics volatilizing into air. And this is being done not too far from the Hudson River and also people's homes. So, you know, we haven't figured it out for PCBs. And you could hear on the news how, you know, where the dredging product is going to be, how that's going to be dealt with now in the Housatonic River in Massachusetts. So I don't have any faith that we're going to be able to miraculously remove and destroy PFAS from sewage sludge.
Thank you, Tracy. There was another question, and I don't know if Wayne might be able to answer this one, or someone else who might be familiar with it, but what about importing sewage from Canada? Can't that be stopped?
Well, that is in the purview of DEC. When a sludge handler, in the case of my county, it's also Casella Organics, they apply to DEC for permission to accept sludge from a wastewater treatment source. And they approved all of the places. And so it's up to them to say, stop. You know, with free trade agreement, there's nothing in importation law that would stand in the way of my understanding of the new NAFTA. I forget that, USMCA, MCA. So they're doing it with the blessing of a state agency, and until that blessing is stopped, it will continue.
Thank you, Wayne. And I think we have time for maybe one more question, which is, what is the best means to isolate and store sludge? Don't know who's the best one to answer that.
Oh, I could take that if no one else does.
Okay.
So one of the people who I get advice from is Mike Ewell at Energy Justice Network, and he has long recommended, it's a national group that opposes incineration and other harmful ways of producing energy. He suggests anaerobic digestion to stabilize the sewage sludge so that it does not release methane, and then putting it in a landfill. That is not an ideal solution, but putting it on our farmland is far worse. And clearly we have to turn off the tap. And I would add that having a dedicated landfill for sewage sludge, and I'm not an engineer who knows about landfills, but that would probably make more sense than mixing sewage sludge with other forms of solid waste.
Thank you, Tracy. So I think for the most part, those were the questions that folks had. We are going to be providing a recording of this to all of the attendees, as well as the final report. If there are any follow-up questions, we have contact information. We're very grateful to everyone for joining today, all of our presenters, all of the folks who worked so hard on getting this report ready. And I just am very grateful to be part of this community, and we thank you all for attending today. Thank you so much. Looking forward to next steps on this.
And thanks for all the people who are knowledgeable who came to this release event as well.
Yes, thank you so much, folks. Take care.